Inspecting raw metal at the mine. Extracting raw metal from the mine.
Transporting raw metal to the mill. Sorting raw metal at the mill.
Cutting and shaping raw metal at the mill. Applying surface treatment to raw metal at the mill.
Welding raw metal at the mill.
Assembling motorcycle components at the assembly line. Installing the engine in the motorcycle frame. Installing electrical components in the motorcycle.
Applying paint and finish to the motorcycle.
Assembling the final motorcycle components. Inspecting the finished motorcycle for quality. Packaging the finished motorcycle.
Shipping the finished motorcycle.
Delivering the finished motorcycle to the customer.
Here are the keys. Congratulations.
Thank you, she looks incredible.
The finished motorcycle at the end of its life cycle. Recovering materials from the finished motorcycle.
Recycling raw materials from the finished motorcycle.
Recovering energy from the finished motorcycle. Managing waste from the finished motorcycle.
Disposing of waste from the finished motorcycle.
The final disposal of waste from the finished motorcycle. The life cycle of the finished motorcycle from cradle to grave. The closed-loop manufacturing process of the finished motorcycle.
The sustainable manufacturing process of the finished motorcycle.
The end-of-life recycling process of the finished motorcycle.
The sustainable recycling process of the finished motorcycle.
End-of-life disposal process of the finished motorcycle.
The closed-loop disposal process of the finished motorcycle.
The sustainable disposal process of the finished motorcycle. The end-of-life recycling facility for the finished motorcycle. The closed-loop recycling facility for the finished motorcycle. Sustainable recycling facility for the finished motorcycle. The end-of-life disposal facility for the finished motorcycle.
The sustainable disposal facility for the finished motorcycle.
The end-of-life recycling process for the finished motorcycle. The closed-loop recycling process for the finished motorcycle. Sustainable recycling process for the finished motorcycle.
The end-of-life disposal process for the finished motorcycle.
The closed-loop disposal process for the finished motorcycle. The sustainable disposal process for the finished motorcycle. The end-of-life recycling facility 2 for the finished motorcycle. The closed-loop recycling facility 2 for the finished motorcycle. The sustainable recycling facility 2 for the finished motorcycle. The end-of-life disposal facility 2 for the finished motorcycle. The closed-loop disposal facility 2 for the finished motorcycle.
The sustainable disposal facility 2 for the finished motorcycle.
The end-of-life recycling process 2 for the finished motorcycle.
The closed-loop recycling process 2 for the finished motorcycle. The sustainable recycling process 2 for the finished motorcycle.
The end-of-life disposal process 2 for the finished motorcycle. The closed-loop disposal process 2 for the finished motorcycle.
The sustainable disposal process 2 for the finished motorcycle.
The end-of-life recycling facility 3 for the finished motorcycle.
The closed-loop recycling facility 3 for the finished motorcycle.
The sustainable recycling facility 3 for the finished motorcycle. The end-of-life disposal facility 3 for the finished motorcycle.
The closed-loop disposal facility 3 for the finished motorcycle.
The sustainable disposal facility 3 for the finished motorcycle.
The end-of-life recycling process 3 for the finished motorcycle.
The closed-loop recycling process 3 for the finished motorcycle.
The sustainable recycling process 3 for the finished motorcycle.
The end-of-life disposal process 3 for the finished motorcycle.
The closed-loop disposal process 3 for the finished motorcycle.
The sustainable disposal process 3 for the finished motorcycle.
The end-of-life recycling facility 4 for the finished motorcycle. The closed-loop recycling facility 4 for the finished motorcycle.
The sustainable recycling facility 4 for the finished motorcycle. The end-of-life disposal facility 4 for the finished motorcycle. The closed-loop disposal facility 4 for the finished motorcycle.
The sustainable disposal facility 4 for the finished motorcycle. The end-of-life recycling process 4 for the finished motorcycle.
The closed-loop recycling process 4 for the finished motorcycle.
Sustainable recycling process 4 for the finished motorcycle.
The end-of-life disposal process 4 for the finished motorcycle. The closed-loop disposal process 4 for the finished motorcycle. The sustainable disposal process 4 for the finished motorcycle. The end-of-life recycling facility 5 for the finished motorcycle. The closed-loop recycling facility 5 for the finished motorcycle.
The Sustainable Recycling Facility 5 for the finished motorcycle.
The end-of-life disposal facility 5 for the finished motorcycle. The closed-loop disposal facility 5 for the finished motorcycle.
The Sustainable Disposal Facility 5 for the finished motorcycle. The End-of-Life Recycling Process 5 for the finished motorcycle. The Closed-Loop Recycling Process 5 for the finished motorcycle. The Sustainable Recycling Process 5 for the finished motorcycle. The End-of-Life Disposal Process 5 for the finished motorcycle.
The closed-loop disposal process 5 for the finished motorcycle.
The Sustainable Disposal Process 5 for the finished motorcycle. The End-of-Life Recycling Facility 6 for the finished motorcycle.
The closed-loop recycling facility 6 for the finished motorcycle. The sustainable recycling facility 6 for the finished motorcycle.
The End-of-Life Disposal Facility 6 for the finished motorcycle.
The Closed-Loop Disposal Facility 6 for the finished motorcycle. The Sustainable Disposal Facility 6 for the finished motorcycle. The finished motorcycle in a high-end presentation.